Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax in the heart of a world teetering on the edge of shadow and light. A child was born, a fragile flame against the encroaching dark. His name was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir to a lineage long steeped in both greatness and sorrow. From the moment of his birth, fate wove a path for him unlike any other, for he carried within him the blood of kings and the weight of an ancient destiny. Even as an infant, he was marked by tragedy. His father, Arathorn, was struck down by an orc's arrow when Aragorn was but 2 years old, leaving him fatherless and vulnerable. His mother, Gilrine, sought refuge in the hidden sanctuary of Rivendell, where the wisdom of the elves would shield and shape her son. There, under the watchful eye of Lord Elrond, the boy was given a name to conceal his true identity, Estel, meaning hope. For many years, he lived among the elves, unknowing of his birthright, learning the ways of the ancient world from those who had witnessed its greatest glories and deepest sorrows. The valley of Rivendell became his home, its halls rich with the melodies of forgotten ages. Under Elrond's tutelage, Aragorn grew into a man of keen mind and strong spirit, absorbing knowledge of history, healing, and warfare. He learned the tongues of elves and men alike, moving through the forests with the quiet grace of his foster kin. Elrond's own sons, Eladin and Elrohir, took him as their brother, teaching him the arts of survival, swordplay, and the silent vigilance of the Rangers. But there was one lesson Rivendell could not teach: how to outrun the destiny that loomed ever closer. On the eve of his 20th year, his truth was revealed. In a quiet chamber beneath the silver glow of the moon, Elrond called him forth and placed before him the heirlooms of his house, the ring of Barahir, a relic of his ancestors, and the shattered remnants of Narsil, the sword that had once felled Sauron. "You are the last of Isildur's line," Elrond told him. "A hope for men in a time when hope is scarce." The weight of his lineage settled upon him like a great mantle, and though he accepted it with solemn grace, his heart was torn. He was no longer Estel, the child of Rivendell. He was Aragorn, heir of Isildur, the man who would one day reclaim a kingdom long lost to time. That same evening, beneath the starlit boughs of Rivendell's ancient trees, he beheld Arwen Undomil, daughter of Elrond, and his heart faltered. She was a vision out of legend, clad in silver and blue, her beauty echoing that of Luthien Tinuvil, the elven maiden who had forsaken her immortality for love. When Aragorn called her by that name, she only smiled, her eyes both kind and knowing. It was a love that could not be, and yet, from that moment forth, his heart was bound to hers. Knowing he could not linger in the comforts of Rivendell, he took up the path of a wanderer. Donning the mantle of the Rangers, he became a shadow upon the land, protecting those who would never know his name. Under the alias of Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, he rode into the service of Rohan and Gondor, fighting in their wars, learning the ways of kingship, not in courts, but upon battlefields. In Rohan, he served King Thengel with honor, and in Gondor, he fought under the command of Steward Ecthelion II, earning the respect of men, yet revealing his true name to none. It was in those years that he first met Gandalf the Grey, a meeting that would shape the course of Middle-earth's fate. The wizard saw in Aragorn not only a warrior, but a leader, one who could bear the burden of uniting the fractured world of men. "There is strength in you," Gandalf told him, "but strength alone is not enough. The world needs wisdom, and wisdom is earned through trial." And trial indeed awaited him. Through the vast lands of Middle-earth, he traveled from the golden plains of Rohan to the shadowed depths of Mirkwood, even as far as the deserts of Harad, where the sun burned cruel, and the stars seemed foreign. He hunted the remnants of Sauron's forces, fought against the dark tide that threatened the free peoples, and yet his path always led him back to a single thought, Arwen. After long years, weary and battle-worn, Aragorn returned to Lothlorien, where she awaited him beneath the golden boughs of Kara's Galadhin. In the hush of the twilight, they stood together, and there, beneath the flowers of gold, they made their choice. Arwen pledged herself to him, forsaking the immortality of her kin for the love of a mortal man. Though joy filled Aragorn's heart, he knew the price of her choice, and the shadow of Elrond's warning lay heavy upon him. "You must become more than all your forefathers," Elrond had said. "Only then will you be worthy of her hand." And so he turned once more to the road, this time with a heavier burden than before. The years stretched onward, and with them, the war against the darkness grew. He fought in secret battles, guarded the borders of the Shire, and when the time came, he pursued Gollum across 1,000 miles of wilderness, knowing that in the creature's whispers lay a terrible truth. The return of Sauron was near. By the time the Ringbearer set forth from the Shire, Aragorn was waiting, knowing that his greatest trial was yet to come. For he was not only a ranger, nor a wanderer, nor even the heir of Isildur alone. He was the hope of men, the last flickering light against the growing storm. And whether he would rise to claim his destiny or fall beneath the weight of it, only time would tell. The winds of change whispered through the lands of Middle-earth as Aragorn, now a seasoned wanderer, watched over the quiet hills of the Shire from the shadows. He had walked many roads, fought in wars both known and forgotten. Yet his path always circled back to the duty he bore in silence. The free folk of Eriador, unknowing of the dangers that lurked beyond their borders, lived in peace because of men like him, rangers, guardians without titles, sworn to protect without expectation of thanks. But now a greater shadow stirred, and the time for secrecy was nearing its end. In the autumn of the year 3018 of the Third Age, Aragorn received word that Frodo Baggins, the bearer of the One Ring, was setting out from the Shire. It was Gandalf's plan that he should meet them along the way, but the wizard had not arrived as expected. Unease crept into Aragorn's heart like the first chill of winter. He knew the Black Riders were already hunting, their presence a whisper of malice upon the wind. The enemy had begun to move. He made for Bree, the small town where travelers and wanderers alike found refuge at the crossroads of the wilds and civilization. There, at the Prancing Pony, he waited, watching from the corner of the dimly lit inn, cloaked in his weather-worn garments, known only to the locals as Strider. When the four hobbits arrived, drenched from the night's rain and wide-eyed with both fear and wonder, Aragorn saw in them the innocence of the world he had spent his life defending. They did not yet know the weight of the journey they had embarked upon, nor the perils that awaited them. It was not long before trouble found them. Frodo, in an unguarded moment of curiosity and misstep, slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished before the entire room. The murmur of startled voices and shifting chairs rippled through the inn, but Aragorn's keen eyes did not miss the deeper consequence. He had felt the shadow stretch toward them, a disturbance that would call the attention of the Nazgul. He acted swiftly, pulling them into the safety of the shadows. "You draw far too much attention to yourself, Mr. Underhill," he said in a voice both firm and urgent, his gaze settling on the hobbit who had just reappeared. The hobbits, wary of this tall, grim-faced man, hesitated. But as the night wore on, they came to understand the danger they were in, and with reluctance, they placed their trust in him. They did not sleep in their rented rooms that night. Aragorn, knowing the Nazgul would come, moved them to a safer hiding place. His foresight proved true when, in the darkest hours before dawn, the wraiths descended upon the inn, their blades seeking empty beds. The true hunt had begun. With urgency, Aragorn led them from Bree, choosing the wild paths over the roads where their enemies might watch. They moved under the cover of trees, crossing streams and winding through forgotten trails, always pursued by the unseen presence of the Nine. He urged them onward, knowing that every hour gained was a victory. But the burden of the ring was already beginning to weigh upon Frodo. The land itself seemed to darken around them, the air thick with the scent of fear. Their journey led them to Weathertop, the ancient watchtower that loomed over the wild lands. There, beneath the open sky, Aragorn built a fire, its flickering light pushing back the encroaching night. But it was not enough. The Black Riders had found them. From the darkness they emerged, shadows given form, their presence suffocating the air itself. Aragorn's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword as the hobbits huddled behind him, fear writ across their faces. Frodo, compelled by some unseen force, lifted his blade, but the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul, struck first. His dagger, dark with ancient malice, pierced Frodo's shoulder, and the hobbit cried out in agony. Aragorn did not hesitate. With a cry that echoed through the night, he drove forward, wielding fire as his weapon, the flames licking against the darkness of their foes. The wraiths recoiled, hissing, retreating into the shadows, but the damage had been done. Frodo lay trembling, his face pale, sweat beading upon his brow. The Morgul blade had done its work, its poison creeping toward his heart. There was no time to waste. Lifting Frodo as gently as urgency allowed, Aragorn pressed them onward. He knew of only one hope now, Rivendell. If they could reach Elrond's halls, if they could hold back the poison long enough, the Elf Lord's healing arts might yet save the Hobbit. Through days and nights, they fled across the wilds, the shadow of the wraiths ever at their heels. Frodo weakened with each passing hour, his breathing shallow, his grip on consciousness slipping. Aragorn did all he could herbs to slow the poison, words of reassurance whispered even as his own heart raced with fear. But still, the darkness chased them, a relentless tide creeping ever closer. Hope arrived in the form of an elven rider, Glorfindel of Rivendell, a warrior of the elder days whose power still shone through his fair form. At Aragorn's urging, the elf lifted Frodo onto his great steed and bid him ride ahead. The black riders, sensing their prey, surged forward in pursuit, their voices rising in a terrible wail. At the very border of Rivendell, the waters of the Bruinen rose at the command of Elrond himself, crashing down upon the wraiths in a foaming torrent. The riders were swept away, their forms broken against the wrath of the river. And for the first time since their flight began, Aragorn allowed himself a breath of relief. But Frodo still clung to the edge of life. As they entered the valley, the golden banners of Rivendell welcoming them home, Aragorn's mind lingered not on victory, but on the fate of the Hobbit who had come so far. Would Elrond's healing hands be enough to turn back the creeping shadow? Would the burden of the ring allow him even a moment's rest? These questions, heavy and unanswered, pressed upon Aragorn's heart. He had delivered the hobbits to Rivendell, but the path ahead was darker still. Sauron had moved. The war had begun. And whether he was ready or not, Aragorn knew that his place was no longer in the shadows. The time to step into the light was fast approaching. Rivendell stood like a sanctuary untouched by time, its waterfalls singing a melody that had echoed for thousands of years. Aragorn had returned to the place of his childhood, yet he was no longer the boy called Estel. He was a man now, carrying the burdens of the wilds upon his shoulders, his heart heavy with the weight of duty. As he walked the familiar paths, the scent of Alanir and Nifredil filling the air, he knew that the peace of Rivendell was but an illusion. The world beyond these borders was darkening, and soon, even this hidden valley would not be safe. Frodo lay upon a white bed, pale as the morning mist, his breath shallow. The wound inflicted by the Morgul blade had nearly taken him beyond saving, but the hands of Elrond were skilled beyond mortal healing. Slowly, under the watchful eyes of Gandalf and the gathered elves, the darkness was driven from Frodo's body, and he stirred once more. Aragorn stood at the edge of the chamber, silent, watching. He had fought many battles, but it was here, in the struggle against unseen forces, that he felt most powerless. The ring had nearly claimed Frodo, and he knew it would not stop its work. This was only the beginning. The Council of Elrond was called soon after, a gathering of many who had come from across Middle-earth, elves, dwarves, men, and halflings, each bearing the weight of their own troubles. Aragorn took his place beside Gandalf, listening as Frodo revealed the burden he carried. The One Ring, Sauron's greatest weapon, had lain hidden for centuries, but now it had returned to the waking world, and with it, the Dark Lord's strength grew. Boromir, son of Denethor, spoke of Gondor's struggles, of the war that already burned at their borders, and the need for a weapon strong enough to turn the tide. "The ring belongs to no one," Elrond said firmly. "It is perilous to all who wield it." Yet Boromir's eyes gleamed with an unspoken desire, the temptation of power whispering to him already. It was then that Aragorn stood, and with quiet purpose revealed the sword he carried, the broken shards of Narsil, the blade that had once struck down Sauron. Boromir's gaze turned to him, narrowing with doubt. "You claim the heritage of Isildur," he said, his tone edged with skepticism. "But Gondor has had no king for many lifetimes." Aragorn met his gaze steadily. "Gondor has no king," he replied, "but a steward only, and the heir of Isildur has not yet claimed his throne." His voice was calm, but within him, the old battle stirred the doubt that had haunted him for years, the fear that he would fail where his ancestors had before. The council spoke long into the day, and at last, a decision was made. The ring could not be hidden nor wielded. It must be destroyed, cast into the very fires of Mount Doom where it had been forged. But who would bear such a burden? Silence fell over the gathering until, in a voice trembling yet resolute, Frodo stepped forward. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." The weight of his choice settled upon them all. Aragorn knew what it meant, that this small hobbit, untested and unprepared, had chosen to walk the darkest road ever laid before mortal feet. But he would not walk it alone. One by one, others stepped forward, Legolas of the Woodland Realm, Gimli of the Dwarves, Boromir of Gondor, and Samwise, Merry, and Pippin, bound by love and loyalty. Last of all, Aragorn spoke. "You have my sword," he said, "not as heir of Isildur, but as a man sworn to protect those who could not protect themselves." Thus, the Fellowship of the Ring was formed. Their journey began under the eaves of Rivendell, where Arwen came to Aragorn one last time before he departed. Beneath the silver starlight, she placed a small gem in his hand, the Evenstar, a token of her love and her choice. "You are not bound to this fate," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "You may yet turn from this path." But Aragorn knew otherwise. "This is my road," he said softly. He kissed her hands and turned away, knowing that the road before him would be long, and the darkness ahead deep. Through the winding passes of the misty mountains, they traveled, their footsteps forging a path into legend. The cold bit at their skin, the wind howled like a beast, but still they pressed on. When the Redhorn Gate proved impassable, they turned instead to the ancient mines of Moria, where deep beneath the mountains lay a realm long lost to time. From the moment they entered the gates, Aragorn's unease grew. The halls of the dwarves were silent, their great stone corridors cold and empty. The air smelled of old death, Here, in the dark, the fellowship was tested. It was not long before the enemy found them. In the heart of the mines, as they stood before the tomb of Balin, drums echoed through the deep. The goblins came swiftly, a tide of chittering malice, their blades flashing in the dim torchlight. Aragorn's sword met them with deadly precision, his strikes guided by years of battle in the wilds. Beside him, Legolas's arrows flew, Gimli's axe sang, and Boromir's horn rang out, defiant against the swarm. Yet even as they fought, something deeper stirred beneath them, a presence older and more terrible than goblins. Then came fire, and a shadow that took shape in the form of a towering demon, its body wreathed in flame, its eyes smoldering with an ancient wrath. The Balrog of Morgoth had awakened. They fled, racing through the vast halls, up the endless stairways, until at last they reached the bridge of Khazad-dûm. There, Gandalf turned, raising his staff against the darkness. "You cannot pass," he thundered, his voice filling the cavern like the wrath of the storm. The Balrog did not falter. It struck with fire and fury, and in that moment, as Gandalf's sword met flame, the bridge gave way. Aragorn watched, horror and grief colliding in his chest. As Gandalf fell into the abyss, his final words ringing through the hollow halls. "Fly, you fools." For a moment, none could move. Then, with a cry of anguish, Aragorn turned, leading the fellowship away from the ruin and the dark. Their grief was heavy, but there was no time to mourn. The journey was far from over, and Gandalf had given them a chance they could not waste. With sorrow in their hearts, they emerged from the mines into the golden light of Lothlorien, a world untouched by the weight of time. But even in the fair woods of the Lady Galadriel, Aragorn knew that the shadow had only begun to fall. The road to Mordor stretched before them still, and the war for Middle-earth had only just begun. The golden woods of Lothlorien shimmered beneath the waning light, their leaves whispering secrets of ages long past. Here, in the heart of an untouched world, the Fellowship found respite, though sorrow clung to them like the weight of a dying star. The loss of Gandalf had carved a wound into their hearts, a wound that no magic nor words could mend. Yet, even in mourning, the road stretched ever onward, and Aragorn knew that they could not linger in grief. As they walked beneath the towering Malorn trees, the presence of the elves surrounded them, silent, watchful, ageless. None spoke as they were led deeper into the hidden sanctuary of Caras-Galadin, where the Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel awaited them. Their hosts were both kind and grave, offering words of comfort, though their wisdom held the weight of sorrow yet to come. Aragorn met Galadriel's gaze and felt the searching depth of her sight upon him. She saw beyond his form, beyond the cloak of the ranger, to the burden that lay upon his shoulders, the path he had not yet chosen, but could not escape. "You are Isildur's heir," she said at last, her voice like wind over still waters. "But more than that, you are the hope of men. The time will soon come when you must decide to rise beyond the ghosts of your past, or to fall beneath them. He did not answer, for what words could he offer? She had spoken the truth he had long feared. That night, as the others rested, Aragorn walked alone through the glades of Lothlorien. He traced the edges of the Evenstar pendant Arwen had given him, feeling the weight of its meaning. Her choice had been made, but was he yet worthy of it? The road to kingship was fraught with peril, and in his heart, the question still remained, would he, like Isildur before him, falter when the moment of choice came? In the morning, the fellowship was given gifts for their journey. For Aragorn, Galadriel bestowed a scabbard to house his blade, and a brooch of silver and green, the emblem of the elves, a sign that he was not alone in the trials to come. He bowed in gratitude, though he knew no gift could light the burden he carried. The time to depart came swiftly. The elves guided them to the edge of the Anduin, where swift boats awaited to bear them south. The fellowship took to the river, its waters carrying them ever closer to the shadow of Mordor. For days, they traveled in silence, the current pulling them through lands both wild and forsaken. But the peace of the river would not last. On the banks of Amon Hen, where the fellowship paused to rest, the weight of the ring began to show its teeth. Boromir, noble yet troubled, had been wrestling with temptation for too long. In the quiet hours, away from the others, he approached Frodo, his voice thick with desperation. "The ring is a gift," Boromir pleaded. "A weapon to be used against the enemy. Why do you shrink from its power?" But Frodo understood the truth that Boromir did not. The ring was no gift. It was a chain, a whispering voice that would twist even the strongest of wills. And as Boromir's frustration turned to force, as his hand reached for the small figure before him, Frodo did the only thing he could. He placed the ring upon his finger and vanished from sight. The world around him blurred into darkness, and in that moment, Sauron's gaze turned upon him. Far away in Barad-dûr, the great eye flared, searching, seeking. Frodo, trembling beneath its weight, barely managed to pull himself free, tearing the ring from his hand and stumbling away. When Boromir came to his senses, shame filled his heart. He had failed not only as a companion, but as a man of Gondor. His own weakness had driven Frodo away, and now the fellowship was shattered. It was Aragorn who found him moments later, breathless, his sword already drawn. "What have you done?" he asked, though he knew the answer before the words had even left his lips. Boromir fell to his knees, anguish written across his face. "I tried to take the ring," he confessed. "I have failed you all." Aragorn closed his eyes for a moment, grief pressing against his ribs. He had known in his heart that this day would come, that the ring would turn brother against brother. But there was no time for anger, no space for blame. The enemy was upon them. A great cry echoed through the trees, and the Uruk-hai descended. They came not in scattered warbands, but in a tide of steel and malice, their eyes black with the will of Saruman. The fellowship, scattered by doubt and fear, had little time to react before the battle began. Aragorn fought at the forefront, his blade carving a path through the advancing foe. Yet even he could see that they were outnumbered. Boromir, wielding his horn of Gondor, fought like a man possessed, cutting down Uruk after Uruk, his body standing as a shield between the enemy and the hobbits he had once sought to betray. But fate is cruel. An Uruk arrow struck Boromir's shoulder, but he did not fall. Another lodged in his side, yet still he stood. He fought until the last, until the third arrow pierced his chest, and only then did his strength give way. Aragorn reached him too late. Boromir knelt, blood staining his lips, his breath shallow. Aragorn dropped to his side, cradling him, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Stay still. Help will come." Boromir smiled faintly, his fingers gripping the hilt of his sword. "I fought for the halflings," he whispered. "They took them, Aragorn the Uruks. They took Merry and Pippin." His voice grew weaker. "I tried to save them." Tears burned Aragorn's eyes. He had seen many men fall in battle, but none like this. "You did not fail, Boromir," he said softly. "You fought with honor." Boromir's gaze met his, and in his final breath, he spoke the words Aragorn had long dreaded. "Our people, my city, I would have followed you, my king." With those words, Boromir of Gondor passed from the world. Aragorn closed his eyes, pressing a hand to Boromir's brow in silent farewell. In his heart, something shifted. He had spent his life fleeing from his birthright, fearing the weight of the crown. But in this moment, kneeling before a fallen warrior who had given everything for his people, he understood he could not turn away. The ring-bearer was gone. The fellowship was broken. But the fight was not over. Legolas and Gimli arrived, their faces pale with grief. But Aragorn was already standing. "We will not abandon the hobbits," he said, voice firm. "Merry and Pippin are still alive, and we will not let them fall into Saruman's hands." Legolas nodded, understanding the unspoken words beneath Aragorn. The journey had changed. The fate of Middle-earth no longer lay solely in the hands of the ring-bearer. It lay in the hands of a king who had finally accepted his destiny. The three turned toward the horizon where the Uruk-hai had fled, and without hesitation, they ran. The chase had begun. The wind howled across the plains of Rohan as Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli pursued the Uruk-hai. Their breaths came ragged, their legs burned with exhaustion, yet they did not falter. The orcs had taken Merry and Pippin, and no matter the cost, they would not allow them to be lost to darkness. 3 against an army impossible odds, yet Aragorn did not waver. His heart, heavy with Boromir's loss, beat with a single purpose: to make right what had gone wrong. For 3 days and nights, they ran, their feet pounding against the endless grasslands, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the captors. The land stretched wide and empty before them, its golden waves shifting beneath the morning sun. At times, Aragorn would kneel, pressing his fingers to the earth, reading the story written in the grass. a broken arrow, a trampled footprint, a torn scrap of cloth. The hobbits lived, at least for now. On the dawn of the fourth day, they met the riders of Rohan. A company of horsemen, clad in armor bright as the morning, thundered across the land, led by a warrior of proud bearing and piercing gaze. Eomer, nephew of King Theoden, halted before them, his men bristling with caution. What madness drives you to chase the orcs so deep into our land? Eomer demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. We seek our friends, Aragorn replied, his voice steady despite his weariness. Hobbits taken by the Uruk-hai. Did any survive? Eomer's expression darkened. We slaughtered the orcs last night. None were spared. A silence fell between them, heavy as stone. Aragorn's heart clenched, but he refused to yield to despair. You fought bravely, he said, but if there is any chance they escaped, we must find them. Eomer studied him. Then his gaze drifted to Legolas and Gimli. You are no ordinary travelers, he observed. And you, Ranger, there is something in your bearing that speaks of kings. Aragorn met his eyes, unflinching. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, he said, his voice calm but firm. And I seek only to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Eomer was silent for a moment. Then, with a nod, he dismounted. Take these horses, he said, gesturing to a pair of steeds. Speed will serve you better than weary legs. Aragorn inclined his head in gratitude. Your kindness will not be forgotten. With swift goodbyes, they rode toward the smoking remnants of the battlefield. The corpses of the Uruk-hai lay scattered in the morning light, their black blood staining the grass. But there, amid the ruin, was hope, a trail leading away from the battle, small footprints pressing into the damp earth. The hobbits live, Aragorn murmured, relief flickering through him. Legolas's keen eyes followed the trail toward the edge of the forest. They fled into Fangorn, he said, his voice tinged with unease. The name itself carried an air of warning. Fangorn was ancient, older than any living memory, its trees vast and brooding. Few who entered its depths returned unchanged. Yet the hobbits had gone there, and so, without hesitation, they followed. The forest swallowed them in silence, its towering trees blotting out the sun. Shadows stretched long between the trunks, and the air felt thick with something unseen, something watching. Even Aragorn, accustomed to the wilds, felt the weight of an old power lingering in the earth. They had not gone far when they found signs of movement, not the hobbits, but something greater, a broken bough, a print too large for any man or beast. The forest had awakened. Then from the gloom, a voice spoke. You should not be so hasty to trespass. They turned, hands instinctively gripping their weapons, only to behold a figure both familiar and changed. He stood tall, cloaked in white, his presence like the first light of dawn after a long night. Gandalf. Aragorn's breath caught. You fell, "I did," Gandalf replied, his eyes filled with wisdom deeper than before. "And I returned." He told them of his battle with the Balrog, of their long descent into the abyss, of fire and shadow, of his death and his rebirth. He was no longer Gandalf the Grey, but Gandalf the White, sent back to finish what had begun. "There is little time," the wizard said. "The enemy moves, and war is upon us. But first, there was a kingdom in need of aid. Rohan, once strong, now withered beneath the corruption of Saruman. King Theoden sat in his halls, his mind poisoned by dark whispers, his will broken by deceit. If Rohan fell, the battle against Sauron would be lost before it had begun. Aragorn understood. His heart still ached for the hobbits, but they were safe for now. His path, as ever, led to war. With Gandalf at their side, they rode for Edoras, the golden hall of the Rohirrim. The city loomed before them atop its hill, its banners heavy with silence. The people watched their arrival with wary eyes, their faces shadowed by fear. War was coming, and they knew it. At the great doors of Meduseld, they were halted by guards, but Gandalf's presence alone was enough to grant them passage. Inside, the hall was dim, its once proud king slumped upon his throne, his eyes clouded, his hands weak upon the armrests. Beside him stood Grima Wormtongue, his voice like oil, his gaze flickering with hidden malice. "My lord," Grima sneered, "these outsiders bring nothing but trouble." But Gandalf stepped forward, his staff gleaming with light. "The king has spent too long in darkness," he declared. It is time he woke. With a word of power, the spell was broken. Theoden's eyes cleared, his strength returned, and as if waking from a long nightmare, he rose. His gaze turned to Wormtongue, and with sudden fury, he cast the traitor from his sight. Rohan had a king once more, but war waited for no man. Even as Theoden reclaimed his throne, word came of an army marching from Isengard, 10,000 strong, their purpose clear. Saruman would not rest until Rohan was destroyed. Aragorn knew what must be done. There was no victory to be had in open battle, only survival in retreat. The people of Rohan would flee to Helm's Deep, the ancient stronghold nestled within the mountains. There, they would make their stand. As the sun began to set, Aragorn rode beside Theoden, his mind already weighing the battle to come. He had fought many wars, but none like this. For the first time, he saw not only the warriors, but the families, the children clinging to their mothers, the old men gripping rusted swords. This was not just another battle. This was survival. And as the storm clouds gathered over the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. Before this night was over, the world would know if men still had the strength to stand. The road to Helm's Deep stretched long and weary beneath the gathering storm. The thunder of hooves and the hurried shuffle of frightened feet filling the silence between heartbeats. Aragorn rode among the people of Rohan, his sharp eyes ever watchful, scanning the hills and valleys for signs of pursuit. the enemy would not be far behind. The Uruk-hai, bred for war, would march without rest, relentless in their hunt. Every moment gained was a moment stolen from the shadow of death that loomed over them. By his side rode King Theoden, his face grim with the weight of leadership. Once, he had been ensnared by weakness, his mind clouded by Wormtongue's poison. But now, he stood as the ruler of Rohan once more. Still, Aragorn saw the doubt flicker in his gaze, the quiet fear of a king leading his people into battle when he was uncertain if they would see the dawn. "The fortress is strong," Theoden murmured, as though reassuring himself. "It has never fallen." Aragorn's grip on the reins tightened. "There is always a first time." They reached the ancient keep by nightfall, its towering stone walls rising from the mountain like a sentinel of the past. The refugees streamed inside, the wounded carried upon makeshift stretchers, the old and the young clinging to whatever comfort they could find in the cold embrace of the stronghold. The warriors of Rohan stood ready, their hands gripping swords and spears with desperate determination, though Aragorn saw in their eyes the same fear he had seen in their king. They were outnumbered, they were outmatched, and the enemy was coming. As the gates shut behind them, Legolas stepped to Aragorn's side, his expression troubled. "They are afraid," the elf murmured in Sindarin. Aragorn exhaled. "They have reason to be." From the walls, he cast his gaze over the dark horizon, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. War was not a thing of glory. It was a thing of blood and ruin. He had fought in many battles, but never before had the weight of so many lives rested upon his shoulders. He was not their king, not yet, but he would fight for them as if he were. The night was restless, filled with the sound of preparations, the sharpening of blades, the hurried whispers of men offering quiet prayers, the hammering of barricades that would not hold. Then, at last, the first cry rang out from the watchtower. "They come." A sea of torches flickered across the valley, an ocean of fire moving with terrible purpose. The Uruk-hai had arrived, their ranks stretching beyond sight, an army bred for slaughter. Drums pounded like a heartbeat of doom, echoing off the stone walls, rattling the bones of those who waited. Theoden stood upon the battlements, his face pale but resolute. "So it begins," he murmured. Aragorn turned to the men around him, their hands gripping weapons, their bodies stiff with terror. He could not promise them victory, but he could give them something else. "Hold your ground," he called, his voice ringing through the keep. "Hold your ground, men of Rohan, sons of Gondor, of the Rittermark, my brothers." He met their gazes, one by one, until the fear began to fade. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. This day we fight. A roar rose from the warriors, swords clashing against shields. The Uruk-hai charged. The first wave struck the walls like a crashing tide. Arrows loosed from the battlements finding their marks, felling many before they could reach the gates. But still they came, their armored forms relentless, scaling ladders raised against the walls, grappling hooks thrown over the stone. The battle had begun. Aragorn moved with deadly precision, his sword flashing as he cut down the first enemy to breach the battlements. Beside him, Legolas loosed arrow after arrow, each one striking true. Gimli's axe swung in brutal arcs, the dwarf's laughter ringing out even as the battle raged. But for every Uruk that fell, another took its place. The sheer numbers of the enemy became overwhelming, and soon the walls were breached. The outer defenses crumbled under the weight of the assault, and Aragorn knew that it would not be long before the deeping wall was lost. Then came the explosion. A deafening blast rocked the fortress as Saruman's sorcery-laden fire ignited within the culvert, shattering the stone in a violent eruption. The ground trembled, and where once there had been a stronghold, now there was ruin. Aragorn was thrown to the ground by the force of it, his ears ringing, his breath stolen. As he staggered to his feet, he saw the Uruk-hai pour through the breach like a flood, their war cries drowning out the screams of the wounded. The gate, Theoden's voice rang through the chaos. They are breaking through the gate. Aragorn did not hesitate. With Legolas and Gimli at his side, he raced down the stairways, cutting through the enemy like fire through dry grass. The great wooden doors of the keep groaned beneath the assault of a battering ram, splinters flying as each strike grew stronger. In a desperate bid to slow them, Aragorn and Gimli leapt into the fray, hacking through the enemy forces at the foot of the gate. But it was not enough. Hope was fading. Then, above the storm of battle, a horn sounded, deep and thunderous. It rolled across the valley, shaking the hearts of all who heard it. Aragorn's breath caught as he turned toward the mountain pass. There, upon the ridgeline, stood a figure clad in white, his staff raised like a beacon. Gandalf, and he was not alone. At his back, the riders of Rohan charged, led by Yomer, their banners streaming in the wind, their voices raised in war cries. The dawn had come, and with it, the fury of the Rohirrim. Aragorn turned back to the battlefield, his strength renewed. To the king, he cried, rallying those who still stood. With a final surge, they broke through the enemy lines, driving the Uruk-hai back. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying, the thunder of hooves, it all blurred into the storm of battle. Then at last, the tide broke. The Uruk-hai, seeing the riders descend upon them like a flood, faltered. Fear entered their ranks for the first time, and in that moment, they were lost. The battle was over. The enemy was defeated. Helm's Deep had held. As the sun rose over the bloodied fields, Aragorn stood amidst the ruin, his sword heavy in his hand. The cost had been great, too many had fallen, and the war was far from won. But this battle, at least, had been a victory. Gandalf approached, his expression solemn yet knowing. "The battle for Helm's Deep is over," he said. battle for Middle-earth is about to begin. Aragorn looked to the horizon, where war still loomed, and knew that his greatest trials lay ahead. The road to Gondor awaited, and with it, the final test of his fate. For too long, he had been a wanderer, a protector from the shadows. But soon, he would have to make his choice. Would he remain Strider, or would he claim the crown that was his by right? The fate of Middle-earth would depend on his answer. The wind carried the scent of blood and smoke as Aragorn stood atop the battlements of Helm's Deep, his gaze turned toward the horizon. The fields below were littered with the bodies of Uruk-hai, their black blood staining the earth. The dawn had broken, and with it, a hard-won victory. But there was little time for rest. The war was far from over. Beside him, Gandalf stood tall, his white robes billowing in the morning breeze. His eyes, filled with wisdom beyond reckoning, met Aragorn. "We have won a battle," the wizard said, his voice calm yet urgent. "But the enemy will not rest. The time has come to ride for Gondor." Aragorn nodded. He had known this moment would come. The war against Sauron would not be decided in Rohan. It would be won or lost in the heart of Gondor, in the white city of Minas Tirith. The steward of Gondor would need to stand firm, but Aragorn knew well the man who ruled in Denethor's stead. The steward was no ally to him, and he would not welcome Isildur's heir. "The beacons must be lit," Aragorn murmured. "If Gondor does not call for aid, Rohan will not ride." Gandalf's eyes flickered with understanding. "Then we must see to it that the call is made." That evening, the company made ready to depart. Theoden would lead the Rohirrim back to Edoras to gather his riders, while Gandalf rode ahead to Minas Tirith to rally the defenses. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli would follow soon after, but before they could leave, another shadow fell upon them. A single rider approached from the east, his armor shining beneath the waning light. A messenger of Gondor. His face was pale with exhaustion, and his voice trembled as he delivered his message. "The city is in peril," he gasped. "Sauron's forces march upon us. The steward has ordered the gates closed. No aid has been summoned." A heavy silence fell over them. Aragorn felt a sharp pang of anger. Denethor, blinded by his own despair, had doomed his people by refusing to seek help. Minas Tirith could not stand alone against the might of Mordor. Without another word, Aragorn turned to his companions. "We must move swiftly," he said. "If Gondor will not call for aid, then we will light the beacons ourselves." They rode hard through the wilds, pushing their steeds beyond endurance. The land of Gondor loomed ahead, its borders marked by the great river Anduin. Across its waters, the land of the enemy stretched dark and endless, the shadow of Mordor creeping ever closer. By nightfall, they reached the Beacon Hills, great watchfires built upon the peaks of the White Mountains, meant to summon aid in times of war. But the beacons lay cold and silent, their flames long extinguished. Denethor had left them unlit, choosing pride over survival. Aragorn dismounted, scanning the towering wooden pyres. If Rohan was to come, the first beacon had to be lit. He turned to Legolas, who needed no instruction. With the swiftness of an elf, he climbed the rocky ledge, his feet barely making a sound. He reached the beacon, and with a single spark, set it alight. The fire roared to life, its flames licking the sky. One by one, the distant beacons flickered awake, their glow spreading across the mountains, reaching ever closer to Edoras. The signal had been sent. Now, it was in the hands of Rohan. Without hesitation, Aragorn and his company rode for Minas Tirith. The city, white-walled and ancient, stood against the encroaching darkness like a lone sentinel, its towers rising into the storm-laden sky. But even from afar, Aragorn could see the change that had come upon it. The enemy was near. As they passed through the city gates, the people of Gondor turned to watch them. Whispers spread like wildfire. A ranger from the north, clad in the worn leathers of the wild, now rode beneath the banner of the White Tree. The heir of Isildur had returned to Minas Tirith, but the steward would not welcome him. Denethor sat upon his throne, a broken man lost to despair. His once proud face was hollow, his eyes dark with madness. He had seen the strength of Mordor and had already surrendered in his heart. "There is no hope," he muttered, his voice empty. "We are abandoned." Aragorn stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You are not abandoned, my lord. Rohan will come." Denethor laughed bitterly. "Rohan cannot save us. No one can." His gaze flickered over Aragorn, cold and unreadable. "And you come here claiming kingship. Gondor has no king." Aragorn held his silence. He had no interest in claiming the throne in this moment. The battle was all that mattered. Denethor turned away, lost in his own madness. "Leave me," he whispered. "Let me die as I choose." There was nothing more to be said. Aragorn strode from the hall, his mind already upon the battle to come. If Denethor would not lead, then he would. The city prepared for war. Soldiers took their places upon the walls. Archers stood ready with bows drawn, and the great gates were barred. The people of Gondor watched from their homes, their faces pale with fear, knowing that the storm was about to break. And then the darkness came. The army of Mordor stretched as far as the eye could see. A black tide of orcs, trolls, and foul beasts marching under the banners of the eye. Great siege towers loomed against the sky, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of monstrous war machines. Then, from the depths of the enemy's ranks, came a figure clad in shadow, a towering wraith, its armor black as night, a crown of iron upon its unseen head. The Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul. A chilling voice echoed across the battlefield. "This city will fall." With a single gesture, the attack began. Aragorn stood upon the walls, watching as the first wave struck. The battle for for Minas Tirith had begun, and in its outcome, the fate of Middle-earth would be decided. The first assault came like a crashing wave, the forces of Mordor slamming against the white walls of Minas Tirith with ruthless fury. Siege towers groaned as they rolled forward, their iron-shod wheels grinding the stone beneath them. The great battering ram, Grond, shaped like the maw of a wolf, was dragged forth by monstrous trolls, its darkened steel gleaming in the torchlight. The city trembled, the air thick with the clash of steel and the cries of the dying. Aragorn was not there to fight beside them, not yet. Even as the storm of battle raged, he rode with the Dunedain, the sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company along the hidden paths of the dead. They had parted ways with Theoden and the Rohirrim, for their path was darker still. If Minas Tirith was to survive, they would need more than riders. They would need an army that could not die. The paths of the dead were no place for the living. The air was thick with the whispers of restless spirits, their cold hands grasping at the edges of Aragorn's mind. But he did not falter. The time for doubt had passed. He was no longer just a ranger or a wanderer. He was Isildur's heir, and this was his moment to prove it. As they passed beneath the shadowed archway, the light of the world faded behind them. Darkness swallowed them whole, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed upon their souls. Even Legolas, of keen elven sight, stood wary, while Gimli gripped his axe as though it were a lifeline. But Aragorn pressed on, his steps sure, his voice steady. "You have my word," he called into the gloom. "Fulfill your oath, and I will grant you peace." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the dead came. They rose from the shadows, their spectral forms half seen in the dim glow of the torches. Eyes burned with a light not of this world, hollow and full of rage. They had been cursed for centuries, bound to the mountain for their betrayal of Gondor long ago. And now they stood before him, their king. The dead did not kneel, but they listened. Aragorn raised Anduril, its reforged blade gleaming even in the blackness of the cavern. "You are oath-breakers no longer," he declared. "Will you fight for Gondor?" A voice cold as the grave whispered in reply, "We will fight." And with that, the tide of fate shifted. Through the darkness, they marched, emerging beyond the mountains, where the corsairs of Umbar prepared their ships for the final blow against Gondor. But they did not see death coming for them. Aragorn and the army of the dead swept upon them like a storm. The ghostly warriors moved through flesh and steel like mist, cutting down all in their path. The enemy, struck with terror, fell before them, and in moments the fleet was claimed. Aragorn stood upon the prow of the lead ship, gazing toward the horizon where Minas Tirith burned. There was no time for rest. The city would not last the night without them. With the wind at their backs, they sailed toward the White City, a fleet of black sails carrying the last hope of men. The battle had turned to ruin. The lower levels of Minas Tirith were lost, fire spreading through the streets as orcs poured through the gates. The defenders fought valiantly, but they were too few, and the enemy was too many. From the highest tower, Denethor, maddened by grief, watched as his city crumbled. He had lost all hope, his mind poisoned by despair. Clutching the broken body of his son Faramir, he muttered words of doom, refusing to see the light that still remained. But hope had not yet abandoned Minas Tirith. As the darkness deepened, a sound broke through the chaos, a horn, ringing across the plains like a thunderclap. The Rohirrim had come. Theoden led his riders over the crest of the hill, their banners streaming in the wind. The golden light of dawn broke behind them as they charged, the ground shaking beneath the weight of their fury. With swords raised and voices lifted in war cries, they struck the enemy like a hammer upon an anvil. The orcs, caught between the walls of the city and the sudden wrath of the Rohirrim, faltered. The tide had shifted, but even victory came with a cost. From the heart of the battlefield, a great winged shadow descended, the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul. He came like a storm, his black steed blotting out the sun, his iron crown gleaming with malice. Theoden's horse reared in terror, and the king fell beneath its weight. The Witch King loomed over him, his dark blade raised for the final blow. But he was not alone. Yoan, shield maiden of Rohan, cast aside her helm and stood between her fallen king and the Lord of the Nazgul. "No man may hinder me," she declared, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. The Witch King laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "No man may kill me." Then Merry, small and unnoticed, struck first, his blade piercing the unseen sinews of the wraith. The Nazgul shrieked, stumbling, and in that moment, Yoan drove her sword deep into the space beneath his crown. The Witch King of Angmar, immortal no longer, fell to ruin. But even as the battle raged, another threat loomed. From the east, the black fleet of Umbar sailed up the river, their dark sails blotting the horizon. The defenders of Minas Tirith saw their doom approaching, the enemy bringing fresh legions to slaughter the remnants of their strength. Then a standard was raised, a white tree upon a field of black. And from the decks of the ships came not corsairs, but warriors. Aragorn had returned. He leapt from the prow of the lead ship, Anduril flashing in the morning light. Behind him, the army of the dead swept upon the enemy, a tide of vengeance that no orc could stand against. The battlefield erupted into chaos as Mordor's forces, now surrounded, fell into disarray. Legolas and Gimli fought by his side, their weapons carving through the enemy ranks. The defenders of Gondor, seeing their lost king returned, found new strength in their hearts. The battle turned, and one by one, the forces of Mordor were driven back. The dead had fulfilled their oath, and with a final word, Aragorn released them, their souls at last free. The fields of Pelennor were drenched in blood, the ground littered with the bodies of the fallen. But Minas Tirith still stood. The White City had not fallen. Aragorn stood before its gates, his sword heavy in his hand, his breath still coming hard. He had fought battles before, but none like this. This was not just a victory. It was the beginning of something greater. He turned to Gandalf, whose eyes, though weary, shone with knowing. "This is not the end," the wizard said. "The Dark Lord still watches. He knows who you are, Aragorn." And Aragorn knew it too. The time had come. He could no longer walk in the shadows, hiding from his fate. If Middle-earth was to survive, he would have to stand as what he was born to be. Not just a ranger, not just a warrior, a king. The fields of Pelennor lay in ruin, the bodies of the fallen stretching as far as the eye could see. Smoke curled from the broken gates of Minas Tirith, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and fire. But the city still stood. Against all odds, against the storm of Mordor's might, they had held. Yet Aragorn knew the battle was not over. This was but a reprieve. The true war had yet to begin. Within the halls of Minas Tirith, the wounded were tended, their cries filling the corridors like whispers of a world still teetering on the edge of destruction. Among them lay Faramir, son of Denethor, his body burning with fever from the black breath of the Nazgul. Eowyn and Merry, who had struck down the Witch King, were not unscathed. They too lingered on the threshold between life and death, their strength drained by the shadow they had defied. Aragorn could not ignore their suffering. Though he had returned to the White City as a warrior, he had also returned as a healer, for the hands of a true king were those that healed, not only those that wielded the sword. With quiet steps, he entered the houses of healing, where the sick lay restless. He took a basin of water, and into it he crushed the leaves of Athelas, the king's herb, long forgotten by many, yet powerful still. As the scent filled the room, cool and sweet, the fevered one stirred. Aragorn placed a gentle hand upon Faramir's brow, and the young man gasped, his labored breathing easing. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, they were clear. "My lord," Faramir murmured, his voice hoarse. "You have come." Aragorn smiled faintly. "Rest now, son of Gondor. Your strength will return." Eowyn, too, awoke, her gaze searching the room until she found Aragorn standing over her. "The darkness is lifted," she whispered. "It is not yet gone," he replied. "But hope remains." Hope. It was the one thing they could not afford to lose. As the sun rose over the broken city, Aragorn met with Gandalf, Eomer, and the surviving captains of Gondor and Rohan. Their victory had come at great cost, but the war was not yet won. Sauron's eye had turned upon them now, and soon his full strength would be unleashed. Minas Tirith could not withstand another siege. "We must march," Aragorn said, his voice steady. "We must take the fight to Mordor." Eomer frowned. "To ride against Mordor itself is madness. We have won a battle, but not the war. We are too few." Gandalf nodded gravely. "And yet, it is our only chance." The room fell into silence. They all knew the truth. The the enemy's forces were greater than their own, vast beyond reckoning. If they marched upon Mordor, it would not be to win by strength of arms. It would be to buy time for Frodo, for the Ringbearer, who even now crept toward Mount Doom. "It is a fool's hope," said Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Aragorn met his gaze. "Then we shall be fools together." With that, the decision was made. The army that rode for Mordor was small, too small to stand against the full might of Sauron. But that was not their purpose. Their task was to draw the eye away, to give Frodo his only chance to reach the fires of Mount Doom unnoticed. It was a march of sacrifice, of men riding not for victory, but for the hope of a world they might never see. Before they departed, Aragorn stood upon the walls of Minas Tirith and looked out across the land. In the distance, beyond the Anduin, the black land loomed, wreathed in shadow. He had spent his life walking these roads, a wanderer, a protector in the dark. But now he rode as something more, not a mere ranger, not just the heir of Isildur, a leader of men. They rode forth beneath the banner of the White Tree, the sigil of kings long thought lost. The men of Gondor and Rohan followed, their faces set with grim determination. And with them rode Legolas and Gimli, unwavering in their loyalty. At last, they came to the Black Gate. It stood vast and terrible before them, its iron towers reaching into the storm-choked sky. Upon its parapets, the minions of Sauron jeered and howled, for they saw the foolishness of the army before them, so few against so many. And then, from the depths of the fortress, came the mouth of Sauron, a cruel servant of the Dark Lord, clad in black armor, his voice like a serpent's hiss. "You come to die," he sneered, his lips curling as he beheld Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, a broken line, a foolish hope. He held up something small, Frodo's mithril coat. The air grew heavy, the men around Aragorn stirring with unease. The implication was clear. The ring-bearer was dead. For a moment, despair threatened to claw at Aragorn's heart. Had they failed? Had it all been for nothing? Then, with quiet resolve, he stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the mouth of Sauron with unwavering certainty. "I do not believe you," he said simply. The dark messenger recoiled, taken aback by the certainty in Aragorn's voice. He had seen kings before weak men, men who cowered before power. But this man did not falter. Aragorn turned away from him, raising his sword high. "For Frodo," he said, voice steady. Then he charged, and behind him, the army of the West surged forward, their battle cries echoing across the plain. They met the enemy head-on, swords flashing, shields shattering, the clash of steel ringing like a final song against the dark. The battle before the Black Gate had begun, and for Aragorn, there was no turning back. He would stand, he would fight, and if this was the last battle he would ever fight, then he would see it done as the man he was always meant to be. The battle at the Black Gate raged like a storm upon the earth. Aragorn fought at the head of the charge, Anduril shining in the gray light of Mordor, cutting through orc and troll alike. Around him, the men of Gondor and Rohan held their ground, though they were vastly outnumbered. They had come not for victory, but for defiance, to stand in the face of despair and buy Frodo his last, desperate chance. And yet, the enemy seemed endless. From the towers of Mordor, new legions poured forth, black-clad orcs, monstrous trolls, and fell beasts that darkened the sky. Aragorn turned, seeing the weight of numbers begin to push them back. Even as they fought with all their strength, the tide was rising against them. Then the ground trembled. A terrible voice filled the air, deep and resounding. A cry of rage that sent terror through the hearts of all who heard it. Sauron had felt it. Aragorn did not yet know what had happened, but something had changed. The enemy faltered for the briefest of moments, their charge hesitating as if waiting for command that did not come. Then, from the heart of Mordor, the land itself seemed to convulse. The sky burned with a sudden, unnatural glow. And then, rising above the jagged peaks, Aragorn saw it, the great mountain, Mount Doom, wreathed in fire. The ring had been found. For one breathless instant, time stood still. The orcs, the trolls, even the great Nazgul upon their winged beasts, all froze as a force greater than any blade struck them. The eye of Sauron, ever watchful, ever seeking, turned its gaze inward. And then the Dark Lord screamed. A shockwave rippled through the battlefield as Barad-dûr, the great fortress of Sauron, began to crack. Lightning split the sky, the foundations of the Dark Tower crumbling as the might of its master was undone. The enemy faltered, their bodies shuddering as if bound by unseen chains. Then the ground beneath them split. The earth swallowed the legions of Mordor, vast chasms opening where once had stood an unstoppable army. The Nazgul, screeching in horror, wheeled in the sky, then fell, consumed in fire as their master, what was torn from them. And still the mountain burned. Aragorn turned, watching as Mount Doom raged, its fury unleashed upon the land. And in that moment, he understood. Frodo had done it. Against all odds, against all darkness, the Hobbit had succeeded. Sauron was defeated. The battle was over. A hush fell upon the battlefield, the enemy scattering like leaves before the wind. The orcs, now leaderless, shrieked in terror and fled. The remaining trolls stumbled, their will broken. Where once had stood an army vast beyond measure, now there was only ruin. Aragorn let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. His sword lowered, the weight of 1,000 years of struggle lifting from his shoulders. Around him, his men stood silent, as if they too could not yet believe what they had witnessed. Then from behind him, a single cry rose, victory. And with that, the men of Gondor and Rohan lifted their voices, their cheers rising to the heavens. Against every fear, against every doubt, they had prevailed. But Aragorn's task was not yet done. Frodo and Sam were still in Mordor, lost in the heart of its destruction. Even as the fires consumed the Dark Lord's domain, they remained alone, spent, with no road home. Aragorn turned to Gandalf, who met his gaze with understanding. The wizard had already seen it, had already known what must be done. "The eagles are coming," Gandalf whispered. And so they watched as the great eagles, led by Gwaihir the Windlord, soared into the blackened sky. Their wings cut through the rising smoke, searching for the two small figures upon the slopes of the dying mountain. And at last they found them, when Aragorn saw Frodo and Sam carried from the wreckage of Mordor, when he knew that the ring-bearer had survived. Only then did he allow himself to close his eyes. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what had been won. Middle-earth was free days past, and the world changed. The shadow had lifted, and for the first time in an age, the land breathed in peace. The remnants of Sauron's forces scattered, leaderless and broken, while the free peoples reclaimed what had been lost. At last, Aragorn returned to Minas Tirith, not as a ranger, not as a wanderer, but as the man he had been born to be. The White City, once scarred by war, now stood in the full bloom of spring, banners of the white tree flying from its towers. And then, upon the steps of the citadel, before the gathered people of Gondor, Aragorn was crowned. As he knelt, the crown of Elendil was placed upon his brow, and Gandalf, with a quiet smile, spoke the words that would echo through history. Now come the days of the king. The people of Gondor bowed before him, but Aragorn did not let them kneel long. He turned to them, lifting his hand. "This day does not belong to one man," he said, his voice carrying across the city, "but to all of Middle-earth." Cheers rose in waves, voices crying out in joy. The long night had ended. Arwen stood before him, clad in silver and green, her beauty beyond anything of this world. She had made her choice, not the life of the Eldar, but the life of a mortal, to stand beside him until the end of days. He took her hand, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It has been long, my love," she smiled, her eyes shining, "but not so long that I have forgotten." So, in the sight of all, he kissed her, and the bells of Gondor rang out in celebration. The days of war had passed, and the days of peace had begun. But even as Aragorn ruled with wisdom and strength, he never forgot the small hands that had carried the weight of the world. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin stood before him, no longer the simple hobbits who had left the Shire so long ago, but legends in their own right. Aragorn knelt before them, and to their astonishment, the king of Gondor bowed. "You bow to no one," he said, and all of Gondor followed suit, bowing before the smallest heroes of Middle-earth. Time would pass, and the world would change. But Aragorn, now a lesser, king of the reunited kingdom, would rule with wisdom and justice. Under his reign, Gondor and Arnor flourished, and the wounds of war began to heal. Yet he was still the man he had always been, the ranger who walked among his people, the warrior who stood in defense of the weak, the healer who placed his hands upon the wounded and made them whole. And when, at last, his time came, he did not fear the end. He embraced it as the gift of men, knowing that he had lived as he was meant to live, not in shadow, not in doubt, but in the full light of his destiny. For he had not been born to be a king. He had chosen to be one, and the world was better for it.